Thank you for being with us for SIMARAMA's Impact Talk podcast and panel discussion today about the documentary film of the month, Stealing Africa, from filmmaker Christopher Goldbrandsen. At a broad level, this is a film that really explores the relationship between multinational conglomerates and poor developing nations that are resource rich with commodity markets that are often left open to exploitation and tax avoidance schemes that really further compound the cycle of poverty in many nations around the world. The specific storyline of the film investigates and exposes Glencore, a major mining corporation, and its control of copper in Zambia. It's really a very eye-opening film. I appreciate it for its journalistic and very fact-driven perspective about wealth and inequality. And it really brings to the forefront the story of global trade out of Zambia, and really a country, you know, with the third largest copper reserves in the world. The great paradox, of course, of that being that 60% of the Zambian population lives on less than $1 a day. And upwards of 80% of the population is unemployed, with, you know, really a tremendous lack of educational opportunities, infrastructure, critical health and social services, despite the country's lucrative extractive industries around oil and mineral and agricultural goods that, of course, do generate billions of dollars in income for global companies like Glencore and specifically its CEOs and shareholders. So Glencore, for those of you who have seen the film, who may need a bit more background information, Glencore is a multinational commodity and mining company. It's the 10th largest company in the world, headquartered in Switzerland, and of course does have a very long history of financial and accounting manipulations, human rights and environmental abuses in their production facilities all around the world. I'm sure at some point in this discussion, we may have a chance to talk on some exciting developments this year in 2018, where there have been some partnership, some sanctions placed on Glencore, and also a U.S. Department of Justice investigation, which remains to be seen, but at least has been initiated at this point. But first, I'd love to thank films like Stealing Africa and organizations like SIMA that amplify these amazing stories for audiences all around the world. And including in classroom settings, you know, where the important work of educating, you know, the next generation on the dynamics of power takes place, and ultimately, you know, looking at ways that we can each play a profound role in holding that imbalance of power accountable. So after the talk, I know that we'll conclude with some actions, you know, that listeners and viewers can take to learn more about this issue and to engage directly on some action items to help the situation in Zambia and in wider Africa. So with that being said, we're very lucky today to have a terrific group of experts who are connected to this topic. I'd like to first introduce Dr. Fola Adeleke, a senior research fellow with the Mandela Institute at Wits University in South Africa, and formerly the head of research of the South African Human Rights Commission. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Fola. It's great to see you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening.
And we also have Dr. Brett Carter, assistant professor in the School of International Relations at the University of Southern California, and the co-president of the Lab on Non-Democratic Politics. I know that Dr. Carter's work focuses a great deal on autocratic regimes and good governance models, which we'll have a great discussion about. And then we have yet to be joined, but hopefully we'll have an opportunity to join them in shortly. Mukasiri Sibanda, professor, an accountant, and economic governance officer at Zimbabwe's Environmental Law Association, a public interest law organization. So hopefully he'll be able to join in shortly. Myself, I'll be sort of loosely moderating the discussion today. My name is Keely Badger. I serve as the Executive Director of Neda Nobari Foundation. So welcome everyone to Simarama's documentary discussion.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So I thought I would kick off the impact talk just by briefly introducing myself and then passing over the mic to our two esteemed panelists to give a bit more of information on their background and area of expertise. My background is in international human rights law. I currently serve as the Executive Director of a philanthropic foundation based in California. We work locally with communities around social and environmental justice issues, really rooted in a universal human rights framework. Our philanthropic approach actually takes a look at the traditional Western aid and humanitarian development model and really flips it on its head. So we prefer to work ground up. In other words, we don't go into communities with what we assume is a set of problems or a set of solutions. We really just make ourselves available to talk with community leaders and see where we can be of service in helping them start or expand programs that are identified as being important to them and their constituents. So with that, I will ask Dr. Fola if you'd like to give us a bit of background on yourself and what you thought of the film.
Thank you. In relation to this specific topic, my background is primarily in investment law, and I've done quite a fair amount of work looking at effective regulation in relation to the extractive industry. I'm interested in transparency practices in both the public and private sector, as well as how to maximize multi-stakeholder models for governance in the extractive industry. And in terms of geographic focus, I primarily work in Africa. I really enjoyed watching the documentary we're discussing today. It was quite insightful and brings a very visual appeal to a lot of research work that's out there that's documented the fact that a lot of African countries are not maximizing the potential revenue they can be getting when it comes to taxes in the extractive industry. I recall I was attending a meeting organized by an institute at the University of London in 2015. And I recall a professor there was provided a shocking statistic when he said in 2011, Zambia had exported close to $10 billion worth of copper and only collected less than $250 million in tax revenue, which amounted to about 2.4% of the export value. And I actually didn't believe that statistic, and I had to go and check it out because it just sounds incredible that you could have a government offering those kind of tax incentives. And that was kind of my introduction into this area of studying the extractive industry and the applicable regulation in the area. And I discovered that Zambia is not unique in this kind of trend. It cuts across a lot of African countries where there's an utilization of different resources, different regulation to maximize the potential income for countries when it relates to extractive and it relates to extraction in their countries.
Excellent, thank you for that. Dr. Brett Carter, I'd love to invite you to introduce yourself and also give us some background on your work.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned earlier, I am a professor in the School of International Relations at the University of Southern California. So my expertise is really in politics and economics in Central Africa. So think countries like the Republic of Congo, which has been ruled by President Denis Sassou Nguesso for all but 5 years since 1979. Think also about Gabon, which has been ruled by the Bongo family since 1967. First, President Omar Bongo between 1967 and his death in 2009, and then since then by his son, Ali Bongo. Both of these countries have long ranked as among Africa's leading oil producers. The Republic of Congo is annually about kind of number 3, number 4, just behind Nigeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea. Gabon, likewise. If one were to examine per capita oil production in the Republic of Congo, in Gabon, one would find that, again, sort of, at these per capita valuations, that their oil wealth is really consistent with OPEC countries, right? And yet, in Congo, in Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, et cetera, poverty rates, right? The share of the population living on less than $1 a day, $2 a day, amounts to somewhere around 50%, 60%. In Congo, the share of the rural population with clean drinking water is about 5%. In urban areas, the share of the population with clean drinking water is somewhere around 50 to 60%. And so it's, in some sense, kind of that paradox. Countries that are so fabulously wealthy in terms of their natural resources, and yet where there are these really kind of profound economic failures, are kind of what kind of compelled my interest in the region in the first place.
Excellent. And actually, that's a great segue into my first question, which I'd love to hear you both speak on, which is, really looking at this paradox. How do we unpack sort of the history behind Africa and the environment, whether it's from a governance perspective, right, or a corporate perspective, the environment that's taken place and that has flourished there, that has led to such profound exploitation of natural resources, and yet the tremendous wealth, right, that's generated from that just does not trickle back to the communities and to the population. I wonder if I could hear from both of you sort of on your perspectives of what's laid the groundwork for this situation to start and really endure in a place like Africa.
Well, I mean, I could go first. Noting that my background is in investment law, I guess that's always my first port of call in asking questions like this. And I think we can trace it all the way back to the period of colonialism, when a lot of so-called developed economies were exiting Africa, and in order to preserve their property interests, they introduced what is now largely known as a bilateral investment treaty regime. And this plethora of regulations called investment treaties contains a number of obligations that are largely in favor of foreign investors. And these obligations imposed fairly strict rules on states, including requirements that make it hard for African states to introduce environmental regulations, new tax regimes to remedy anomalies in existing investor-state contracts. And given the broad scope of some of these obligations, it has effectively curtailed the regulatory powers of a lot of African states. And so we find a situation where some of these treaties have been in existence for quite a number of decades and will continue to be valid for a few more decades to come. So recognizing that the powers of some African states have been curtailed through international investment treaties, it's very hard for governments to introduce either environmental or tax law regimes to remedy some of the problems that we're increasingly picking up. And because of this history, it has become extremely difficult for for new laws to be introduced. Increasingly, there's been a pushback, not only by African states, but also developed economies as well. New agreements that are currently being negotiated. There's a pushback against these traditional investment treaties. Similar obligations are being introduced to corporations, and even multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are already noting concerns about the extent to which some of these existing regulatory regime is affecting the ability of African states to effectively govern. So I think this turnaround and this shift is something that governments need to embrace and take the opportunity to identify new ways of taking back control and management of their resources.
Yeah, so I mean, I think those are all great points. I too, tend to view the origins of the continent's current economic situations as rooted in its past, right? So in the same way that here in the United States, our long history conditions are contemporary politics and social issues. So too, throughout the African continent as well. But I tend to think, or I'll kind of emphasize a different kind of aspect of this. So during the colonial period, European governments ruled their colonies from the capital cities with very kind of little room for citizens in those countries to engage in the electoral process, right? So there was, I think, a politics that, to put it mildly, was not based on any kind of government accountability to citizens. Whenever countries across the continent claimed their independence, in many ways, politics didn't change as much as one might have expected. So, for instance, Omar Bongo of Gabon took power in 1967. He was effectively in charge of the country for a few years prior to that, with the support of the French government, in particular of Charles de Gaulle. And their sort of bargain, in a way, was that President Bongo would supply the French government, in particular the Elf oil firm, with oil that was priced well below the market value. And in exchange, the French government guaranteed President Bongo's personal security, that is, from the threat of mass protests, and even potentially from the threat of a military coup. Again, in exchange for providing oil on such kind of attractive, below market prices. So as a result, President Bongo, in some sense, was sort of accountable more towards, more to the French government and more to kind of the ruling clique around him than he was to his citizens. As a result, his government built less than 5 kilometers of road per year throughout his tenure. That created an environment, where, for instance, small agricultural producers simply weren't able to get goods to market. That created an environment where property rights that might attract investors were quite weak because power was so concentrated at the center. And to my mind, this has a lot to do with why Gabon still ranks, despite its massive oil revenue, as among the poorest countries in the world.
Mm. And that's a great point. I think that, the film really drew out, right, is the complicity of foreign governments, right, with these multinational corporations and their dealings, and really the intentional pursuit to allow, CEOs and major decision makers to, avoid extradition, to avoid accountability. I believe for a period of time, the CEO of Glencore was on, the FBI's most wanted list. and of course had hiatus in Switzerland at the time. But really looking at looking beyond the corporate level, but looking also as well to the political level and how these practices are allowed to flourish without real accountability.
Yeah.
So to that point, I want to transition really to the next question, which is on accountability, and sort of get both of your thoughts on what sort of accountability mechanisms exist, whether it's at the state or regional or perhaps international level, to enforce corporate responsibility, around international human rights or environmental standards or tax evasion standards. Do we see that there are any concrete ways to hold mining companies like Glencore responsible for their impact in countries like Neda and elsewhere? I might go to you, Dr. Fola, for that question first, if that's okay.
Okay. I mean, I think when it comes to international accountability mechanisms, most of them are more or less voluntary guidelines or guiding principles. So at the UN level, we've got the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. At the Africa level, we've got the African Mining Vision, which is not being implemented by states. Then we've got some other multi-stakeholder mechanisms like AITI. You have the World Bank's IFC sustainability framework, and then the OECD also has its own guidelines on multinational enterprises. So these are all voluntary guidelines and guiding principles which effectively relies on the good faith of corporations when it comes to accountability. So currently there's a big push by South states, particularly Ecuador and South Africa, initially leading the charge to actually have a binding treaty on business and human rights. And it's quite important to have this kind of binding treaty because there's a real gap at the international level to be able to hold corporations accountable. You've got double taxation treaties currently that exist, which gives multinational companies the leeway to be able to escape, to be able to effectively engage in tax evasion. And things like this require cooperation among states. It requires cooperation among tax agencies within governments, and we can't keep relying on that kind of good faith engagement to promote accountability. We really need to move on to something where you could have real enforcement mechanisms in place.
So I think that Fola raises a good point, and if I could emphasize something about the EITI mechanism, and I think that this sort of underscores the extent to which in certain parts of the continent, again the parts of the continent where governments are far less accountable to their citizens, these mechanisms have really been systematically undermined by governments themselves. So, for instance, so the Republic of Congo, under Denis Sassou Nguesso, received EITI status, I believe, in 2011 or 2012. And this, despite what we know now was sort of massive corruption, really throughout the extractive sector, the oil sector, the mining sector, et cetera, including actually in which Glencore was implicated. But Sassou Nguesso was able to achieve EITI status because he was able to place one of his kind of senior allies, who himself had been quite corrupted kind of in the extractable sector, to in some sense validate Sassou Nguesso's EITI report. So in a way, I think that the failure of the EITI mechanism in Central Africa to really foster accountability, in some sense, that is an outcome of the governance failures that we've already discussed. And so in a way, I think the real question becomes, what citizens in the Republic of Congo, in Gabon, can do to force their governments to abide these sorts of transparency standards, and also then potentially, what citizens in other parts of the world can do to hold corporations responsible, for the massive kickbacks that they make in a pretty systematic way to ruling governments. And I think that's an ongoing question. Certainly, I think consumers in in North America, in the Western Europe, to the extent that they're willing to use their purchasing power to boycott firms that we know have engaged in corrupt practices, that's obviously a good thing. I think it's also a good thing to put pressure on our own elected officials to do our part in enforcing anti-corruption laws that apply to firms, in our own countries. And this, I think, has really been a failure, or something that that we've not done nearly enough of. There has been precedents for the French government, for the U.S. government, to prosecute Central African ruling families for corruption. But I think we haven't done nearly enough to prosecute American and French-owned firms who engage in those practices as well.
Mm. And I'm curious to gain both of your thoughts on sort of this struggle or tension, right, between local or regional accountability structures and mechanisms versus, what I think a lot of people in the international human rights or humanitarian space would advocate as a necessity for some sort of transnational corporate accountability court or, legally binding treaty with a complaints mechanism for victims, and access to remedy for victims. Where do you sort of place yourself in that debate as to whether the solution is more a local regional solution or whether corporate accountability would entail some sort of transnational body?
I think you need all three. I think at a national level, some states have a strong judiciary. A state like South Africa, for instance, would be an example. But majority of states in Africa don't have a very strong judiciary. So at the national level, you actually need to have very strong judicial mechanisms in place. At a regional level as well, you need the African Union to effectively, they've got a very great policy document in place in terms of the African Mining Vision. And that mining vision establishes a secretariat which has not been funded at the moment. So you need, at the AU level, have a very strong mechanism in place as well for these visions to be implemented. And then at an international level, I think there's so many opportunities for us to fill the regulatory gap as well. Multinational corporations are often seen as contributors to global inequality, and I do think that inequality is probably the greatest challenge of our time. And the flexibility and ability of multinational corporations to exit markets with their capital, the creation of global value chains that weaken the economic impact of corporations within states, and the manipulation of state regulation to the advantage are some of several concerns which has led to this intense public scrutiny and demand for corporate accountability. And for you to be able to deal with all these issues, you need this three-pronged approach of national, regional, and international. I do think that people are already speaking about the possibility of having a court similar to the ICC that looks at the liability of corporations, of multinational corporations in particular. So I think there is an appetite, at least from an advocacy perspective, for this kind of mechanisms. The question is whether states are willing to push this further. If you continue to have South states leading the charge without cooperation or agreement from OECD countries, you're not going to make a headway. So you actually need these developed economies to come to the table as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I would add two things. One with respect to international institutions on the African continent itself, and the other with respect to international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. First, I think at the moment the African Union has sort of the orientation for the African Union has really been set by governments in the continent that frankly are not models of good governance. So increasingly Chad. So for instance, Moussa Faki, the current chair of the African Union, is the former foreign minister of Idris Deby in Chad. Idris Deby has decided that he will not hold elections again until I think the price of oil returns to $80 a barrel. I mean, something quite absurd like that. So I mean, it's I think there certainly a push from the African Union to hold international firms accountable for certain corrupt practices, anti-environmental practices throughout the continent. That's certainly a good thing. But I think to the extent that we might want to rely on the African Union itself to begin to impose transparency requirements on member governments, I think that's at the moment an uphill battle. And I would also add that with respect to international financial institutions, such as the World Bank and the IMF, they haven't done or taken, I think, as much initiative, in providing a solution to these issues as they might otherwise. So, for instance, there's been a financial crisis in Central Africa over the course of the past 3 or 4 years. The proximate cause of which was the global decline in oil prices, and so consequently, the 6 governments that comprise CEMAC, the Central African Economic and Monetary Union, applied to the IMF and the World Bank for debt relief, many of which having just received debt relief just 6, 7, 8 years ago. And so, at some point, the IMF and the World Bank are going to have to grapple with the fact that, by providing financial support to governments that have very bad track records in terms of human rights violations, in terms of economic mismanagement, in some sense, kind of fosters these same governance failures that have, helped create the position in which certainly the central part of the continent now finds itself.
Mm. And I wonder too if we can speak a bit about sort of the other side of this, right, which is how foreign investment can actually benefit local communities. And I'm curious to gain both of your thoughts on that, and also if you can think of any sort of models, right, that we know are working in that context that we can look to as promising, both in terms of sort of a better corporate practice in commodity markets, and also a better corporate practice that facilitates better governance in these countries.
I do think that if done well, multi-stakeholder governance initiatives can work. If you have a system like the AITI that brings in corporate actors, governments, and civil society to effectively address issues around accountability and how to provide resource benefits to communities, I do think that is an effective system. I think that community engagement is always key. The concept of free, prior, and informed consent cuts across a lot of international instruments, and it is important that communities engage in processes of activism, utilizing well-resourced NGOs to not only litigate, but also utilize grievance mechanisms of corporations or grievance mechanisms of financiers of resources of mining corporations. It is also important that states begin to think about introducing licensing conditions for some of the licenses they issue to different resource extractors. In South Africa, there's the opportunity for companies to effectively give back to the community where they're extracting by having to contribute a certain percentage of their profits on a quarterly basis to social and economic development. So I do think that if you can consider a number of options, a state should be part of a multi-stakeholder initiative like the AITI. Government should introduce licensing conditions and, empowerment of communities to effectively engage with companies and governments could also go a long way in trying to bring back benefits of resource extraction to communities.
Yeah. So, I tend to, I agree with Fola. I think that's all well put. I tend to be of the mind, that, globalization, offers tremendous benefits, or at least potential benefits to the continent. So, if one was to look at, say, per capita GDP as a measure of economic welfare over the course of the past 60, 70, 80 years, it's pretty clear that over the past 20 to 30 years, starting kind of really in the kind of mid-1990s, that many parts of the continent have grown dramatically. For instance, in South Africa, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Kenya, the size of the middle class has expanded in a really significant way. There are emerging emerging technology sectors in many parts of the continent. Think Lagos, certainly South Africa. Think Silicon Mountain. In Cameroon, in the area around Douala and Buea. So in a way, I think that to the extent that we can support this this emergence into as a major part of the global economy. I think that's all to the good. But I think certainly in Central Africa, the really critical issue is ensuring that that governments supply the sorts of public goods, opportunities for education, opportunities for secure property rights, strong judicial institutions that will attract and sustain private investment. I think that these are the real keys to long-term growth, and I think that we all have a part in ensuring that, say, for instance, American firms, French firms, are sort of part of the solution, rather than part of the problem.
Absolutely. That's a great point, and segue actually into my next question. Obviously, I think many of us who work in this space know that, the 100 largest economies of the world are actually private companies. So there's a lot to be said around stakeholder interest, fiduciary responsibility. But really, I think the starting point is consumer awareness and behavior around our purchasing power and the types of corporate practices that we support. Usually unknowingly, very few people have thought about what goes into making our phones, right? And the cost of that tool and accessibility, particularly in developed countries. where that accessibility is much more prominent. So I wanted to just quickly touch on the role of the consumer here, what sort of power consumers have and should realize they have in charting, you know, a world ahead where our products and our services are provided to us from companies that know that we place a certain expectation on their corporate behavior, whether it's nationally or internationally. So just a couple of thoughts on purchasing power and consumers' responsibility in this context.
I do think that multinational corporations are beginning to recognize the fact that ethical behavior is quite important for their bottom line, even in terms of attracting the right candidates to work for their companies. Increasingly, millennials are choosing companies that are eco-friendly and choose ethics over profits. So I think there's probably a recognition to an extent that there is a public shift, public perception in terms of the role of the corporation, and that they're just not about profits. And quite often, consumers are also shareholders. And I do think that shareholder activism is very key. When shareholders, both big and small, start placing value in terms of a company's performance when it comes to their environmental impact assessments, when it comes to how they're doing in terms of the socially responsible reporting index, those kind of things are matter to the bottom line of a corporation. And I do think that consumers ultimately can play that role of being the watchdog to the corporation. There are successful examples that have taken place in the past, which has led to a dramatic turnaround in terms of how a corporation outsources some of their production chain to East Asian countries and the working conditions in those countries. So I do think that the average consumer and the average shareholder holds a powerful place in this chain of accountability.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, we've talked you know, somewhat about governance failures you know, on the part of some countries in Central Africa, but I think that, you know, the counterpart to that is the fact that European citizens, you know, North American citizens, you know, really people around the world have their own responsibility to play in ensuring that their governments, you know, corporations based on their own soils play a constructive role as well, right? So I mean, you know, if American citizens, you know, want the IMF and the World Bank to pursue better policies in Central Africa, you know, that don't sustain unaccountable governance, you know, we should be, you know, at the very least, we should be voting for, you know, for congressional representatives and senators, you know, who share our views, right, and presidential candidates, you know, as well. You know, to the extent that you know, we want, you know, the manufacturers, you know, of our iPhones to source cobalt in a way, you know, that you know, does not help foster violent conflict in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. You know, we need to make those demands, you know, of firms, you know, that are based in Cupertino, California, and elsewhere, right? I mean, you know, we in some sense, I think, you know, have a tremendous amount of responsibility in demanding better, frankly, of our governance, of our own corporations, and to the extent that, you know, that we've failed to do that, you know, over the past, you know, number of years, you know, I think reflects poorly on us, and I think is something that, you know, we need to be honest with ourselves about as well.
Great point, and I think certainly part of the mission of SIMA is to provide tools, educational tools and resources like films like Stealing Africa and others that help illuminate these issues in such a compact, very informative way, right? The film is 58 minutes, right? So an individual can sit down for an hour and learn about a part of the world that they probably know very little about, and issue areas that are extremely complex, that may be challenging to come at in any other sort of context other than a storytelling viewing experience. But to walk away with at least some form of understanding of what's happening in these contexts. So thank you for that. I'm conscious of the time. I know that we are just at our limit. I had a couple hot button issues. I just wanted to check in with you, Dr. Fola and Dr. Carter, on your timing. I know I wanted to get to China's role in Africa, but I don't want to keep you if you've got classes to teach and important work to be doing. So are you okay to stay on for another 5 minutes, or do you need to?
Sure, yeah, I would love to talk about Chinese engagement.
Okay, is that okay with you too, Dr. Fola?
Yes, certainly.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so China's role in Africa has been heralded as perhaps the next plight of Africa, perhaps a new form of neocolonialism. There's been some very positive things as well said about the flow of resources into states, primarily around land grabs and agricultural development projects. I'm curious to get both of your thoughts on China's role in Africa, what you project as being some of the issues that we're going to see there in the next few years.
I wouldn't go as far as calling China's role in Africa as a new form of colonialism. I do think that the situation is different now. In the 50s and 60s, African states were largely, they were not as, they didn't have the kind of experience or benefit of hindsight that they do have now. So when it comes to the choices that African governments are making, they are deliberate choices, not necessarily choices that are being imposed to them by China. And I do think that the embrace of China has been largely due to some of the favorable loan arrangements in place, where in some countries, there's an exchange of infrastructure built by China for resource extraction, rather than the payback of loans rather than the exchange of cash. There's also the fact that conditionalities on good governance, for instance, are not being imposed on some of the Chinese loans that some African states take, and not necessarily African states only, but also subnational governments so take for instance, in states across Nigeria, they are also directly engaging with some Chinese agencies. So I do think that it's not neocolonialism per se, but there's a concern that there's going to be an increase in economic dependence on China, and this may have long-term impact in terms of economic and environmental sustainability. And I do think that the onus does not lie on China to address the situation. The onus lies on African governments. They are the ones deliberately making these choices, and it is worrying that, knowing what we know after 50 years since the end of colonialism, that we are deliberately making similar mistakes. And I do think that is a cause for concern. And I think that what we are suffering from as a region is a cause of poor policies. It's a cause of weak governance and a failure to translate resource wealth into social and economic progress. And we need to go back into doing the hard work of building institutions that can build frameworks that lessens the impact of exploitation by other countries on our resources.
Yeah, I agree. I think that to refer to Chinese engagement as neocolonialism understates, the atrocities that colonial governments committed quite frequently, to be honest. Just as Fola said, there are, I think, both benefits to Chinese engagement and drawbacks. Among the benefits, and again, Fola referenced this, is the extent to which the Chinese government and state-owned agencies, have invested in major infrastructure projects across the continent that have had and will continue to have really tremendous economic benefits. So think, for instance, of the East African Railway Initiative that is going to link parts of South Sudan, Burundi, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania to the port at Mombasa. Think, for instance, of new highways that are being built by Chinese construction firms in the Republic of Congo and certainly elsewhere as well. Deepwater ports also. So these are major infrastructure projects that African governments have long sought. That the IMF and World Bank and other Western donors have frankly underprovided. And so now there's certainly a trend that the IMF and the World Bank and other Western partners are moving to provide the same kinds of infrastructure investments that the Chinese government is doing. So I think that that's really a major benefit of Chinese engagement. At the same time, we know that the Chinese government is completely willing to engage with governments across the continent, regardless of their records of economic mismanagement or human rights violations. We also know that Chinese aid tends to be directed towards a president's kind of native region or kind of native or kind of core political constituency at much higher rates than similar development projects by the IMF and the World Bank, right? So there's I think a set of the politics in some sense behind Chinese engagement are in some sense probably going to reinforce governments that may not have very good records of economic management and human rights. So I think there are some real benefits to Chinese engagement and some real drawbacks.
Mm. And sort of taking nations and corporations sort of out of the puzzle, I want to perhaps hopefully land on something a bit more promising or inspiring, and that is if we can think of any positive or at least initiatives that hold the potential to be positive for countries like Zambia in terms of, whether it's new technologies, whether it's new for-profit, for-purpose companies set to do work in Africa that sort of enhance social and environmental accountability. Do we have any sort of promising initiatives that we could look to that viewers and listeners could keep an eye out for in the coming months and years?
Well, I think on my end, if I'm correct, Zambia is, so from a regulatory perspective, Zambia is already part of the EITI process. And I do think that if that is at least a good step in the right direction. And I do think that if we look at the possibility of expanding initiatives like this to having something, for instance, like beneficial ownership transparency, I think these kinds of regulatory initiatives might go a long way in tackling what I would call capital flights from countries like Zambia. We know that capital flows from Africa is more than the official development aid. to Africa and more than foreign direct investment to Africa as well. So I do think that from a regulatory perspective, we should be looking towards curbing illicit financial flows, and there are very exciting and new initiatives being introduced at the continental level to address this problem. And I do think that Zambia potentially has the opportunity to adopt these initiatives for the benefit of its people.
So I will, I suppose, answer this in a slightly sort of perhaps different way than you intended. I would love for your listeners to know the story of Ng Collins Gaba. So Ng is a Cameroonian young man who won the Google Coding competition in November 2016, I believe it was. He became the first African young person to win the Google Coding competition. And this is sort of basically, an exercise open to teenagers from around the world who are, required to complete, kind of various kind of, computer science, coding type tasks, right? And Ng Collins Gaba became, the first African citizen to do so. Now, what made his accomplishments extraordinary, however one looks at it, it was especially extraordinary because of ongoing unrest in English-speaking parts of Cameroon, which I'm happy to talk about, and I hope listeners at the very least look up on Wikipedia. So in the midst of this internet shutdown that had been caused by the Cameroon government, Ng Collins Gaba managed to win this great Google coding competition. So my, I guess, ultimately, cause for optimism is that there are, a tremendous number of extraordinarily talented people, around the world and across the continent. And so, to the extent that the international community can contribute to, in some sense, helping unleash that talent, that I think is where, or is what ultimately will generate sustainable, durable, long-term change.
Excellent. And I'll just add to that conversation. Part of my work in the last year has been really looking at blockchain and particularly non-cryptocurrency based blockchain technologies in developing countries. And of course, we know that at least 60% of populations in developing countries have an SMS phone, and they can connect to the global economy through that. The issue, of course, has been the platform through which they do that. And so looking at non-cryptocurrency based platforms where individuals at the last mile can actually formally build an economic identity, whereas previously individuals would not be able to be banked, right? This dynamic between the unbanked and the banked, which I see more and more of in the press, and hopefully we'll hear more of as we move along here. But looking at blockchain to provide a secure and immutable transactional record between individuals and mainly the world's poor at the last mile who work around extractive industries or in agriculture and are at the very end of that supply chain, right? But, A, are usually exploited at the end of the supply chain, and B, don't reap any of the benefits of that transactional work with global companies, of course, that are buying and selling the commodity that they work with. So I've taken great hope in that as a poverty alleviation tool, as a sort of democratization of power through technology, and really providing a formal record, right, for people so that they can get themselves out of poverty. Oh.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the expansion of digital technology, really throughout the continent, over time will be used, by really incredibly talented entrepreneurs, to solve problems that those communities understand far better, than people who don't live in those communities do. We've seen that happen, for instance, in the medical sector in Cameroon, which recently is in the process of being revolutionized, by a series of technologies, that are again based on the smartphone. So I completely agree about the prospect for kind of the digital revolution to really begin to have a dramatic effect.
Absolutely, and connectivity will be key, and luckily it looks like that is set to explode tremendously in the next few years. So, well, I want to thank you, Dr. Fola, Dr. Carter, for this terrific conversation. I know this is a very complex issue, and there's so many areas that we, of course, by nature of the time limitations, couldn't touch on. But thank you for your participation, and thank you to all of you for listening and for tuning in. Just a reminder, Simarama is a monthly online film club for award-winning impact cinema pieces that connects members directly with creators, experts, live panels like this one, and collective actions. We'd really love for you to go online and take a look at the actions that have been curated specifically around the film Stealing Africa and around these issues. You can go to www.simarama.club, and you can also follow SIMA across social media platforms on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram using hashtag Simarama to engage in the conversation. So once again, thank you so much. And I believe all of those links will also be available in the description below this video.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.